I am Dr. Márcio Pereira, a neuroscientist, and I dedicate my work to studying how the human brain constructs emotions, bonds, and behavioral patterns that we rarely consciously perceive. Today, I want to talk about something that seems simple at first glance, but which hides one of the deepest conflicts of the human mind. Why are you afraid of being alone but live unhappily in company? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. People say they fear loneliness because humans are social beings, because we were made to live in groups, because isolation hurts. This explanation circulates in books, conversations, social media, and even in simplified scientific discourse. It sounds logical, comforting, and sufficient. But it isn't. What almost no one realizes is that this fear doesn't stem exactly from a desire for companionship, nor from love, nor from a genuine need for connection. It stems from something much more primitive, more silent, and harder to admit: the fear of facing one's own mind without distractions. When someone says they can't stand being alone, they're usually not talking about the absence of other people. They're talking about the presence of themselves. The human brain, throughout evolution, has learned to associate belonging with survival. In ancestral times, being outside the group meant a real risk of death. The nervous system, therefore, developed automatic mechanisms to generate anxiety in the face of separation, estrangement, and rejection. This fear is not rational. It is visceral. It arises before thought, before logic, before choice. The problem begins when this mechanism, created to protect, starts governing emotional decisions in a world that no longer functions according to the same primitive threats. Today, nobody dies from spending a night alone at home. But the brain reacts as if it were facing imminent danger. The limbic system interprets silence, the absence of messages, the end of a relationship, or even a Sunday without plans as signs of abandonment. And abandonment for the brain still means risk. This is where the paradox arises. People enter relationships not because they deeply desire that connection, but because they need to silence the anguish that arises when they are alone. They seek presence to numb their own inner restlessness. They seek conversation to escape their own thoughts. They seek affection not as an exchange, but as emotional regulation. And, ironically, that's exactly what makes these relationships so unsatisfying. Because when the other person is used as an emotional tranquilizer, they cease to be seen as an individual and begin to be perceived as a resource, an anchor, a buffer against emptiness. The relationship ceases to be an encounter and becomes a strategy for psychic survival. In this state, the brain operates in scarcity mode. Dopamine doesn't arise from genuine connection, but from the expectation of relief. Attachment mixes with anxiety. Affection is confused with fear of loss. And slowly, coexistence begins to generate tension instead of security. The person feels accompanied, but not at peace. They are beside someone, but internally they remain alone. This happens because the same system that creates the fear of loneliness is the one that sabotages the ability to truly be with another person. The brain enters a state of emotional hypervigilance. It monitors signs of rejection, interprets silences as threats, exaggerates minor conflicts, and anticipates abandonment. All of this happens below the conscious level. The individual believes they are suffering because of the other person, when in reality they are reacting to internal circuits that have been operating for years without being questioned. And there's something even more unsettling about all of this. Modern society reinforces this pattern all the time. It romanticizes being together, sells the idea that happiness is shared, that being alone is a sign of emotional failure, that love should fill voids. Movies, music, social media, everything points in the same direction. Being alone is dangerous. Being in a relationship is normal. But the psychological cost of this narrative is rarely discussed. Because when someone enters a relationship to escape loneliness, they end up bringing into the relationship exactly what they fear most: emptiness, insecurity, dependence, the fear of being abandoned. And this creates a silent cycle of dissatisfaction where the person can't leave because they're afraid of being alone and can't stay because the relationship is suffocating her. This is where the question arises that almost no one wants to ask, but which changes everything when it is finally faced. If being with someone hurts and being alone is scary, What exactly are you trying to avoid feeling? This question marks the beginning of something deeper, because the answer isn't in the other person. It's in an internal conflict that begins long before adult relationships, long before conscious choices, long before the stories we tell ourselves. And it is precisely this conflict that we will begin to dismantle in the next chapter. When we look more closely at the fear of being alone, we realize that it is rarely linked to loneliness itself. What is truly frightening is what emerges when the external noise ceases, when there are no more messages to answer, voices to hear, expectations to meet. It is in this silence that the brain reveals what has been carefully avoided for years. Human beings do not fear the absence of others. They fear encountering themselves without filters. From a neurological point of view, this fear has a clear origin. The brain is a prediction machine. It constantly seeks to reduce uncertainties, anticipate risks, and maintain a minimal sense of control. When we are alone, without external stimuli, the system enters a state of internal scanning. Repressed thoughts emerge. Unresolved memories return. Feelings of inadequacy, guilt, failure, or emptiness find space to manifest themselves. That's why so many people avoid silence. They fill their time with noise, social media, relationships, empty conversations, anything that prevents the mind from turning inward. Not because the external world is so interesting, but because the internal one seems unbearable. And here a crucial point arises. The discomfort that appears in solitude is not created in that moment. It was already there. There simply wasn't space for it to be perceived. The human mind learns very early on to associate emotional relief with the presence of another person. Even in childhood, the nervous system understands that emotional regulation comes from the outside. Being held, a voice, a look, attention. This is natural. The problem arises when this pattern does not evolve. When an adult continues to expect the other person to do what they themselves have not learned to do internally, to calm, validate, support, contain. At this stage, the relationship ceases to be an encounter between two whole people and becomes an unconscious attempt to outsource one's own emotional balance. The presence of the other becomes a kind of psychological anesthesia, and like all anesthetics, it works for a while, until it stops working. It is at this moment that dissatisfaction begins to grow. The person feels that something is wrong, but cannot name it. They complain about the relationship, the partner, the routine, the boredom, the lack of connection. But deep down, the discomfort doesn't come from the other person. It comes from the fact that the other person can no longer silence what insists on emerging from within. The brain then enters into conflict. On one hand, the attachment system activates the fear of loss, abandonment, and loneliness. On the other hand, the self-protection system begins to generate irritation, emotional detachment, and even contempt as an unconscious way of creating space and relieving internal tension. This is how many relationships become paradoxical. The person fears being alone, but ends up rejecting the presence of the other. They desire closeness, but feel suffocated. They want connection, but cannot tolerate real intimacy. And there's something even deeper at work behind it. The human brain is extremely sensitive to internal coherence. When someone lives out of sync with their own emotional needs, when they ignore their boundaries, silence their desires, or remain in relationships that don't reflect who they are, the nervous system enters a state of chronic alert. This state generates anxiety, irritability, emotional exhaustion, and a constant feeling of diffuse dissatisfaction. The person can't explain what's wrong, they just feel like nothing fits. And then, paradoxically, she concludes that the problem is herself, that perhaps she is incapable of love, that perhaps she is too demanding, or worse, that she doesn't deserve better. This type of conclusion doesn't stem from reason. It stems from a brain tired of sustaining unresolved internal conflicts. Society, in turn, reinforces this cycle by romanticizing the idea that being in a relationship is synonymous with emotional success. Little is said about the quality of presence, the emotional maturity needed to sustain a healthy bond, or the importance of knowing how to be alone before being together. Thus, many people remain trapped in relationships that diminish them not out of love, but out of fear. fear of facing the silence, fear of confronting themselves, fear of discovering that the loneliness they so desperately avoid comes not from the absence of the other, but from the absence of themselves. And it is precisely here that the most uncomfortable question of all arises, the one that almost no one wants to ask, but which completely changes the way one views their own relationships. Could the fear of being alone actually be the fear of discovering who you are when no one else is there to distract you? This is the question that takes us to the next level of analysis. Because to answer it, we need to understand how the brain constructs repetitive, affective patterns, and why so many people seem to unconsciously choose relationships that cause them suffering. When we observe a person's emotional trajectory over the years, we rarely find isolated stories. What almost always emerges is a pattern. Different relationships, different faces, different contexts, but strangely similar feelings. The same frustration, the same type of conflict, the same feeling of giving more than one receives, or of feeling emotionally trapped. This doesn't happen by chance. The human brain doesn't choose partners randomly. It recognizes familiar emotional patterns, even when those patterns are painful. What was experienced in early relationships, especially in childhood, creates an internal map of reference for what constitutes affection, closeness, rejection, and security. This map is not conscious. It forms before language, before logic, before the capacity for reflection. It settles in as a bodily sensation, a silent expectation about how relationships should function. If affection is accompanied by instability, the brain begins to associate love with tension. If care is unpredictable, the brain learns that to love is to wait. If recognition only comes after effort or sacrifice, the brain learns that one must suppress oneself to be accepted. Over time, these associations cease to be perceived as learned experiences and begin to be felt as normal. That's why so many people say things like, "I don't know why I always end up in relationships like this. It seems like I attract the same type of person. When everything is going well, I find it strange." What they call bad luck is, in fact, neurological coherence. The brain seeks what is familiar, not what is healthy. And here emerges one of the cruelest mechanisms of the human mind: unconscious repetition. The nervous system repeatedly tries to recreate situations similar to those of the past, not because it wants to suffer, but because, in a primitive way, it believes that this time it can control the outcome. It's a silent attempt to correct the past. The individual enters into relationships that trigger the same pains, the same insecurities, the same fears, in the unconscious hope that now everything will be different. But since the internal starting point remains the same, the result also tends to be. This process consumes an enormous amount of psychic energy. The brain remains in a state of alert, monitoring signs of rejection, trying to predict behaviors, constantly adjusting itself so as not to lose the bond. Love ceases to be a space of exchange and becomes a field of emotional surveillance. And it is in this state that the most painful contradiction arises. The person begins to desire solitude as relief, but deeply fears the emptiness they believe they will find. Because without the other, there is no distraction. Without the other, there is no validation. Without the other, there is no mirror. And the inner mirror, for those who have never learned to support themselves emotionally, can be frightening. The brain then enters a cycle of silent dependence. It begins to confuse presence with security, proximity with value, and attention with love. And any threat to this system, distancing, conflict, or potential separation, is felt as an existential threat. That's why many people stay in relationships that make them unhappy. Not out of weakness, not out of lack of intelligence, but because, at the deepest level, the nervous system believes that known suffering is safer than the unknown void. In this context, loneliness is not feared for what it is, but for what it can reveal. It reveals the absence of a solid internal axis. It reveals difficulty in emotional self-regulation. It reveals a dependence on external validation. It reveals a disconnection from oneself, and this revelation is deeply uncomfortable. That's why the brain prefers repetition. It prefers predictable conflict to uncertain silence. It prefers familiar frustration to the risk of looking inward and realizing that perhaps the entire emotional structure built up to that point needs to be reviewed. The great irony is that the more someone runs away from solitude, the more lonely they become internally. Because they start living for others, disconnected from themselves, from their own limits, their own needs, and even their own desires. And it is precisely at this point that the most difficult question begins to take shape, a question that does not concern the other, but one's own identity. If you can't stand being alone, who exactly do you believe you are when no one is watching? This question leads us to the final stage of this analysis, a point where it is no longer possible to blame the past, relationships, or society. A point where the mind needs to confront what it has been avoiding for a long time. That's what we'll explore in the next chapter. There comes a point inevitable for everyone when distractions cease to work. Not because the world changes, but because the cost of continuing to run away becomes greater than the fear of stopping. It is at this point that loneliness ceases to be an external threat and begins to reveal itself as what it always was: a mirror. Not a cruel mirror, but an honest one. When someone finally finds themselves free from the noise of relationships, without constant validation, without the role they learned to play to be accepted, something uncomfortable happens. The mind, accustomed to defining itself through others, loses its bearings. Silence ceases to be merely the absence of sound and transforms into the presence of questions. Who am I when I don't need to please anyone? What do I feel when there's no one to distract my attention? What is it about me that so desperately seeks to be chosen? These questions don't arise clearly. They emerge as restlessness, diffuse anxiety, a malaise difficult to explain. The brain, accustomed to avoiding these sensations, quickly tries to fill them with stimuli. Social media, messages, excessive work, new relationships. But when that's no longer enough, confrontation becomes inevitable. And this is where the most important rupture occurs. Because the fear of loneliness was never, in fact, a fear of being alone. It was a fear of facing one's own emotional incompleteness, a fear of recognizing that part of one's identity was constructed to please, to adapt, to survive. A fear of realizing that many choices were born not from desire, but from the need to avoid being abandoned. Over the years, the brain has learned to confuse love with relief, presence with security, and approval with worth. And when these pillars begin to crumble, a frightening sense of emptiness emerges, not because it's destructive, but because it reveals how far one has lived detached from oneself. This emptiness, however, is not a mistake. It is a space where the nervous system for the first time can learn something new. That emotional regulation doesn't need to come from the outside. That silence isn't abandonment. That being alone isn't the same as being helpless. But this learning process requires something rare: tolerance for discomfort. It is necessary to endure the absence of stimuli, to endure one's own anxiety without numbing it, to endure the feeling of not knowing who one is for a while. Most give up at this point. They return to familiar relationships, even painful ones, because the brain prefers familiar suffering to uncertain reconstruction. But those who remain, even if afraid, begin to realize something fundamental. Loneliness, when faced with awareness, ceases to be a void and transforms into a foundation. It is at this stage that the individual begins to differentiate between neediness and desire. They begin to realize that not every desire to be with someone stems from love. Many are born from escape. And, little by little, they learn to sustain their own presence without needing to erase themselves to fit into someone else's life. The ultimate paradox is this: only when someone learns to be alone without despair do they become truly capable of being with another. Because then the connection ceases to be a necessity and becomes a choice. The other person stops being an emotional patch and becomes an encounter. The relationship ceases to be a crutch and becomes a space for genuine exchange. But this transformation doesn't happen dramatically. It's silent, subtle, almost imperceptible. It manifests itself in small decisions, saying no when before you would say yes, leaving when before you would stay, staying when before you would run away. And perhaps the final question, the most important of all, is not whether you are afraid of being alone. Yes. What exactly Do you believe you would lose if you finally stopped running away from yourself? Because the answer to that question doesn't just define your relationships. It defines who you are when no one else is there to define it for you.